Hello, everyone. My name is Nkechi Owu from the University of Ghana, and I am pleased to be the chair for this Africa Day special edition of the ACEIR webinar series. Now, ACEIR stands for the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research. Now, the establishment of ACEIR directly addresses the analytical, empirical, and data needs that are required for policy interventions and civil society action aimed at turning the tide against inequality. Now, ACEIR partners are located in Western, Eastern, and Southern Africa, specifically in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, respectively. And I myself am a research fellow within the Ghana node of ACEIR. Now, today we will be listening to a presentation by Dr. Muna Shifa on the topic, Recent Trends and Patterns in Spatial and National Inequalities in Sub-Saharan Africa, Evidence from DHS Data. Dr. Muna Shifa is a Senior Research Officer in the Southern Africa Labor and Development Research Unit, popularly known as SALDRU, at the University of Cape Town. She holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Cape Town and a BSc degree in statistics from Addis Ababa University. Her research focuses on land tenure systems and rural livelihoods, urbanization and development, social cohesion and inequality, in addition to the analysis of poverty and inequality. She also teaches postgraduate courses on complex surveys and measuring poverty and inequality at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. Now, Dr. Shifa's presentation will take about 40 minutes, after which she will respond to questions, comments, and other contributions from the audience. Now, during the presentation, questions from the audience can be entered into the chat box, and these will be posed to the speaker at the conclusion of her talk. Now, alternatively, audience members may also, at the conclusion of the presentation, raise their hands and then make their contributions verbally to the presenter. Thank you very much for joining us for this, and I would at this time like to invite Dr. Shifa to share her screen and begin her presentation.
Thanks, Nicole. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thanks everyone, and happy Africa Days. Today's paper is the work by me and Marie Leibbrandt, which looks at recent trends and patterns in spatial and national inequality in sub-Saharan Africa using data from DHS.
Mona, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you like to use the PowerPoint presentation mode?
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I think that little button at the bottom, yes, right there, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so given that today is African Days, I thought then it would be great to start with highlighting some of the progresses and challenges that African countries made as a whole. So this is not part of the paper that I'm presenting, but celebrating African Days is about celebrating our success and also reflecting our common challenges. So I'm going to provide some figures in this regard. So since the mid-1990s, African countries have registered significant high level of economic growth after 2 decades of stagnation in economic growth, which is impressive. And there was also significant progress in terms of access to education. Recent estimates show that average primary gross enrollment rate was from 68% to 106% between 1995 and 2012. But still, there are some challenges. For example, more than 50 million primary and secondary school age children are out of school still in sub-Saharan African countries. There is also significant progress in many health indicators. So we can see that figures for like life expectancy, under 5 mortality rates, and maternal mortality ratios significantly declined in sub-Saharan Africa. Life expectancy increased significantly, mortality under 5 mortality rates and maternal mortality ratios have significantly declined between 1990 and 2015. However, still there is significant challenge in terms of, for example, reducing maternal mortality ratios. If you compare the figure for sub-Saharan Africa with South Asian countries, the number of the maternal mortality ratio currently, recently, for example, the data for 2015 is at the level which was in 1990 for South Asian countries. So you can see there is a significant progress, but African countries still remain behind in terms of health challenges. There's also progress in reducing extreme poverty measured by the number of people living below $2 a day. The figure declined from 55% in 1990 to 42% in 2018. This is not a big decline, but at least there is a progress in terms of reducing the proportion of people living in extreme poverty. However, the number of people living in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa decreased compared to other African countries. So if you look at this graph, it shows the bar shows the number of people who are considered in extreme poverty. The lines indicate, the dots and the lines indicate the proportion of people who are considered in extreme poverty. So as you can see that countries in sub-Saharan Africa had relatively smaller number of people in extreme poverty in the 1990s, but this number increased over time. While in other poor and developing countries, although they started with a very high number of people in extreme poverty, the number declined significantly. And also the proportion of people who are in extreme poverty also declined significantly in other poor regions compared to sub-Saharan Africa. So there is progress, but of course there is significant challenge remains in terms of reducing extreme poverty. Several factors have been given for why sub-Saharan African countries didn't decrease poverty compared to other developing regions. And one of the highlighted factor is sub-Saharan African countries also have on average high level of fertility rate compared to the countries in Asia and Southeast Asian countries. And the type of the composition of growth also is different compared to countries in South Asian Pacific countries. Sub-Saharan countries, although they have high economic growth, it's mainly the composition analysis indicates that it's mainly highly reliant on extraction of natural resources, either it's mineral or other natural resources. The other challenge the continent faces is high level of inequality. Although it is very challenging to get consensus about the extent of inequality in sub-Saharan African countries due to data limitation, but some previous studies indicated that in fact in sub-Saharan African countries, inequality has been increasing since the 1980s. And this is very important in terms of reducing inequality, poverty, since countries with high level of inequality also experience low growth elasticity of reducing poverty. And also high inequality also associated with conflicts and political instabilities. The other challenge we are facing now is, of course, the pandemic. The pandemic exacerbates existing challenges. So this is the highlights of the day. We have some progresses, but we have also many challenges to address the continent. Coming back to our paper, the objective and motivation of the paper is that we know that there is a significant limitation in terms of using household surveys to analyze inequality and poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. The recent paper published, ACEIR paper published by Rocco and Mari provided a very nice summary of this challenge. So one of the problems, for example, is that if you are using household surveys to measure inequality, richer households are less likely to be included in the surveys. When it comes to poorer households also, if you use consumption survey or consumption data, which is common in measuring inequality in sub-Saharan African countries, you cannot really capture the publicly subsidized basic services such as education, access to basic services, which are highly public subsidized in Africa. So there are significant challenges in terms of using household surveys to measure income, poverty, and inequality in the continent. Some studies try to use indirect methods to avoid these problems. For example, the paper by Young tried to use data from DHS and use different standard indicators, including education and other household assets, to predict consumption levels in sub-Saharan Africa. And the results show that there is significant progress in terms of consumption growth in sub-Saharan Africa, which was a contradiction with other previous findings, which use household survey data. So there is no consensus in terms of the extent and level of income inequality, poverty in sub-Saharan African countries. The data challenge also becomes more problematic when we try to estimate spatial inequalities, regional inequalities within a given country. So this is problematic in measuring consumption, for example, because in many cases prices vary significantly across regions in a given country, but usually we use a single national price data, which is problematic. And many of the data sets do not provide representative samples at sub-regional levels. And to avoid some of these challenges, also some studies use nighttime light data to estimate spatial inequalities and analyze patterns of spatial inequalities across the world in sub-Saharan African countries. So our paper falls within this research area, and what we do is we use the DHS dataset, which provides, which collects data from more than 90 countries in the world, and including 43 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The advantage of DHS is it collects relatively comparable data across countries in the world, and also even if it doesn't collect income or consumption data, it provides detailed indicators other than income indicators of well-being. So we use that data to estimate inequality in income dimensions of inequality in non-income dimensions of well-being. So let me talk about how we measure household welfare or economic status. We use two indicators from DHS. The first one is we use 18 living standard indicators from 27 sub-Saharan African countries, which have comparable data in recent years. So one of the challenges when you use also when you try to measure non-income dimensions of well-being is the assets available, asset information available in different countries can be different, and also depending on the context, also one asset which could be important in one country might not be important in another country. So we face those kind of challenges. But in this paper we try to use comparable asset indicators, which we think are important in terms of measuring well-being to assess asset inequality. The living standard indicators can be categorized into the following 6 groups. The first one is ownership of durable assets, which includes TV, radio, refrigerator, car or truck, bicycle or motor bicycle, or a telephone. The basic service, the other one is basic service indicators, which includes measures of access to water, sanitation, and electricity. The other one is building conditions, number of rooms per capita, type of floor material, whether it's good quality or poor quality, and type of fuel used, whether it's a clean type of fuel or not. And the other variable we use or dimension is education, number of maximum years of schooling in a household. And we also use some indicators to measure assets, rural assets, such as ownership of whether the household have land for agricultural purposes, or whether they have livestock, livestock ownership. So we use these 18 living standard indicators to calculate household wealth or asset indices. The second indicator we use is access to basic services. This is a narrower version of the asset index. Compared to the more detailed indicators we use for the 27 African countries, we can find a relatively comparable measure for access to basic services such as education, access to basic services including water, electricity, sanitation, and access to telephone. So we can get a relatively comparable measure of these indicators since 1995. There are 89 surveys in 36 sub-Saharan African countries. Of the 36 sub-Saharan African countries, 27 of them have more than one survey since 1995. So this allows us to estimate change in inequality over time in access to basic services. It's also important to consider or analyze inequality in access to basic services because access to basic services such as education and telephone or water, electricity are largely dependent on public investment rather than individuals' effort. So it indirectly implicates inequality of opportunity. So by itself is important to consider in addition to the advantage of being comparable. The other important to analyze inequality in access to basic services, we have seen that inequalities in access to basic services can be related also inequalities in vulnerability and prevalence of the pandemic, such as the coronavirus pandemic. So inequalities in access to basic service can also translate into inequalities in health outcomes. So this is important to also analyze inequality in access to basic services by itself. So once we have the indicators, we have chosen the indicators to measure household asset wealth and basic services. We have to combine them into one index to measure, to do our inequality analysis. There are several ways to do this aggregation, and one of the common ways to use it is statistical approach, which is principal component approach, factor analysis approach, and so on. So we use such a statistical approach to aggregate the various indicators into one index. We use the uncentered principal component analysis, which is proposed by Schoenberg and Marie Leibbrandt. And unlike the principal component analysis, the uncentered principal component analysis does not weight rural assets or other uncommon assets negatively. So if you use principal component analysis or rather standard approach, often rural assets and other non-common assets will be weighted negatively, which has implication for analyzing inequality. So we use the uncentered principal component analysis, which solves that problem. So to calculate asset indices, there are two approaches you can use to generate weights. One, you can generate weights for each country, or the other approach is you can generate weights by pooling the surveys across countries. So if your aim is to estimate inequality across countries, it's recommended to put the survey across countries and generate weights. So you use a single weight for each country to analyze inequality. this is also the approach that can be used when you try to compare inequality across time and across countries. So you can put all the surveys across time and across countries, and this allows us to compare inequality over time and across countries at the same time. So in measuring the asset wealth, we pulled all the cross-sectional data set from the 24 countries into one, then generate the assets index weight and calculate the asset index for each country. When it comes to the basic service indices, we follow the same procedure. We pull for each country, we pull data across time and generate the weights and calculate the asset index. We also pulled all the surveys across countries and across time and generate the weights. But the results are not significantly different when we use the approach. So we use when we report our inequality analysis, we use the pooled. We use the pooled approach. So we can see from the following table the variables that we use to measure the assets index and the weights generated from based on the asset principal component analysis. So based on this weighting, we can see that access to refrigerator, access to car, and the use of clean fuel for cooking have relatively higher weights, which is expected, but rural assets in general have lower weights. When we also generate asset weights for after pulling the data from all countries and surveys for access to basic services, this is the resulting weight we obtain. So access to electricity and pipe water have the highest weight, followed by access to phone and telephone and maximum years of education. So we use these weights to calculate asset indexes for each country. Then we use that asset index to calculate our inequalities for each country. Next, I'll talk about how we measure regional inequalities. In order to calculate regional inequalities, after calculating asset indices for each country or access to basic services for each country, we calculate average asset indices or basic service indices for each region within each country. Then use that as a measure of welfare for that for a particular region. So that's what we have here, YI, the average asset or wealth value for each region, or as an average asset basic service index for each region. Then we use a coefficient, the population unweighted coefficient of variation to measure regional inequalities, spatial inequalities, which is the common approach to use to calculate spatial or regional inequalities. So according to this formula, the coefficient of variation is given as follows. Here we have YI, the average assets index for each region, minus this Y bar is the average asset index for the country. So this is the gap between the two. And K is the number of regions within each country. We also calculated the Gini index using the standard Gini index formula. So YI is average assets index for region I, and YG is the asset index for region J. So these are the same like the upper number of regions, and Y bar is the average, overall average asset index for a country. Okay, some of the results are present as follows. As we can see from this, I can't see this one, let me put it down a bit. Okay. So this is the result for assets inequalities, household asset inequalities. So we can see that not every country have data during the same year. So for example, Mozambique has data, the latest data available for Mozambique is 2011. Burkina Faso is 2010, but most of the countries have data after 2012 or 2013. So you can see also the challenge to the challenge in terms of comparing inequalities across countries, because they don't collect it at the same time period. So from this we can see that the level of inequality, Gini coefficient, is higher in Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. If you compare like countries which have data since 2014, you can see that the figure is higher for Lesotho, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Democratic Congo. Here we have Nigeria. So these countries have high level of asset inequality, national asset inequality. And I think most of these countries are also have higher level of income inequality. While countries such as Rwanda, Mali, Benin, Rwanda, Mali, Burundi, and Burkina Faso have relatively lower level of asset inequality, both national inequality and spatial inequalities. So the figure also shows us some kind of positive relationship between the level of spatial inequality the country has and the level of overall inequality. We try, so we compare our asset inequality estimates with income inequality figures from the World Income Inequality Database for the years which is closer to the years we have data from DHS. So we can see that there is a positive relationship between the two indicators. We have here national Gini coefficient for income. On the x-axis, we have national Gini coefficient for assets. Although obviously we can see that the estimated Gini coefficients for assets are below the that of income. Obviously, we expect that, given that the way we measure assets is based on 0, 1 daily variables. So the variation in assets is much lower than the variation in income data. But despite that, we can see that there is a positive relationship between the two measures. So countries which have high level of income coefficient, Gini coefficient, such as Namibia, Lesotho, Zambia, Mozambique, also have a relatively high level of asset inequality. So there is a positive relationship between the two indicators. Next, we decomposed the overall national asset inequality estimates into between and within region components. This allows us to look at the contribution of between region components compared to within region components of inequality. So as you can see that from this figure, most of the countries, I think about 9 of the countries, the regional component of inequality contributes more than 30%, about 30%. From Zimbabwe, Guinea, Namibia, Mozambique, and with the figure being the highest for Democratic Congo, where the regional component of inequality contributes close to 39% of the overall inequality. So this has important indication, even if we aim to reduce overall inequality, reducing regional inequality will contribute a lot to overall inequality reduction. Next, I'll present some of the results from inequalities in access to basic services. Here there are 2 graphs. This shows the inequality, interpersonal inequality in access to basic services, which is national inequality, overall inequality. Here we have inequality, spatial inequality. So as we can see that there is significant variation across countries. The color indicates that the blue color indicates low level of equality, while the red color indicates high level of equality. So this is a figure which is slightly different than that Marie presented last week, where in case of community, we see high level of inequality in Southern African countries compared to other regions. But in this case, we can see that inequality is relatively lower in Southern African countries, such as South Africa, Lesotho, Namibia, and Gabon. While inequality is higher in other Central African countries, East African countries. So Ethiopia, Madagascar, Congo, Mozambique, Chad, Burkina Faso, all these have higher level of inequalities in access to basic services. We have also similar kind of pattern when we look at spatial inequalities. Countries like Mozambique, Madagascar, Chad, Central Africa, and Ethiopia, Congo, all these have higher level of spatial inequalities. So this is slightly different from what we see when we look at income inequality. So countries in Southern African countries have relatively higher proportion of people with access to basic services compared to other countries in Africa. Next we try to look at the changes in inequality in access to basic services. As I said before, countries that have surveys for different years. So it's really not easy to compare changing inequality across time for different countries. But what we have seen, what we have here is we consider only countries which have at least one data set before 2010 and one data set after 2010, with about at least 10 years of gap to see the progress they have made in this period. So if you look at the graph, we have changing inequality or spatial inequality in the x-axis. That there is significant progress in terms of reducing access to basic services in many of the countries. Of course, this is expected that because in many of the countries there is significant expansion of access to basic services to the poor. So that will be captured in the way we measure as our assets, because it's a 0-1 variable. So which means if poor people have better access to basic services, obviously the inequality measure will decline. So the next question will be, okay, what contributes to the such differences in reducing access to basic services across countries? And this task will be very difficult because analyzing drivers of inequality even in a given country will not be that easy, let alone analyzing drivers of inequality across countries. So what we just did here is we just look at the relationship between GDP growth rate and changing in access to basic services. So for each two data point estimates of inequality, we calculated the average GDP growth rate, and on the x-axis we have this average GDP growth rate. For the data points we have inequality estimates, and on the x-axis, on the y-axis we have change inequality estimates, spatial inequality estimates, and national inequality estimates. So we can see from the graph that there is no, in fact, there seems there is a negative relationship between GDP growth rate and change in inequality in access to basic services. So it's fair to say that there is no link between the extent of average GDP growth rate and decline in inequality. So in the paper, we try to just to highlight the difficulty of comparing countries across time in terms of the extent of GDP growth and change in spatial inequality, we considered, for example, the case of Ethiopia and Rwanda. So you can see in both measures of inequality, Ethiopia performed significantly much better than Rwanda. And the two countries seem similar in terms of their level of history. Both countries have been in civil war, and they emerged from civil war in the early 1990s. In both countries are not dependent on natural resources such as minerals, oil, and the two countries also kind of follow similar kind of developmental strategy. Both countries try to use developmental states approach to the developmental strategy. But still, we can see that after experiencing significant economic growth rate, the two countries performed significantly different in terms of reducing inequalities. So we need, in order to understand why these discrepancies exist, we have to really understand the context of other contexts in detail. For example, one potential reason could be like Ethiopia follows more of started with rural, invested heavily in rural sectors. So while Rwanda relatively focused on the service sector. So this might also be one potential reason why there is a significant difference in terms of.
No, you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Next, we try to compare also our inequality estimates from access to basic services to income inequality. Clearly, we can see that there is no relationship from the graph. So as you can see from here, South Africa, which is characterized by high level of income inequality, have very low level of inequality in access to basic services, while countries which have a high level of inequality in access to basic services, such as, for example, Ethiopia and Niger, have in fact have low level of income inequality. So there is no relationship between access to basic services and income inequality. This could be one explanation. Could be possibly that, of course, access to basic services increases welfare of individuals and welfare of individuals, but this might not necessarily translate into increase in income or in reducing income inequality. So the South African example explains that access to basic services does not really translate into access to into reducing income inequality. And also many countries have really done well in terms of expanding education, for example, but the quality of education varies by space and socioeconomic status. And this has implications to reducing income inequality. Okay, to summarize, so in this paper, we try to use comparable data from different African countries to measure inequality in non-income dimensions of well-being. And our results show that inequality in household assets is high, given that we use a demi-variable to measure assets. So a figure of Gini coefficient between 0.4, 0.5 is a very large figure compared to if we use income instead. So it indicates that there is high level of inequality in sub-Saharan Africa. In many countries have significantly reduced inequality in access to basic services, with the exception of few of them. But also inequality in access to services remains very high in sub-Saharan African countries, especially in some of the countries, the Gini coefficient is above 0.4. We also find strong relationship between inequality, spatial inequality, and national inequality. This implies that policies focused on reducing spatial inequality have significant implication in terms of reducing national inequality. Also, our findings show that inequality rankings of countries can vary depending on the type of indicators we use. And there are also, we also highlight that the challenge that to measure inequality, even if we use a single indicator, will not be that easy. For example, if you use education, for example, to measure inequality across African countries, it's very difficult to measure quality of education. So this means we can underestimate the level of inequality even with one indicator. So the inequality estimates we have provided here only indicates the lower bound of inequality. So if we get really proper data sets, this implies that there is high level of inequality in sub-Saharan African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shifa, for this presentation. At this point, I would like to invite questions, comments, contributions from our audience. I see Rosalie's hand up. Rosalie, can you please unmute and then ask your question? Rosalie, are you there? So I see Rosalie's hand up. Rosalie, if you can hear me, you can kindly unmute and then speak. Okay, I'm not hearing from Rosalie. So can I go to Monica? Rosalie, while you resolve, if there's an issue at your end, may I call on Monica then to submit her question while we wait for Rosalie to come through? It seems as if participants are unable to unmute themselves.
I have unmuted them, Nkechi.
Okay, then let me try Rosalie once more and hopefully she can come through. I can see that the symbol beside her name still says she's muted, but Rosalie, if you can hear me, can you try to speak so that we can take your question? Okay, I don't see Rosalie on here anymore, so I'm going to switch to Monica. Monica, do you have a question?
Okay. 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 Thank you very much for the very nice presentation. I just have two questions, please. So Mona, I was just wondering if you have had the chance to actually look at the specific indicators that are driving the access to basic services, for instance. I know in creating the index, it gives you an average effect, right? But I'm just wondering for the different countries, have you had a chance to look at which particular one is driving the result? Is it access to water? Is it access to sanitation? Is there access to, so that we are sure of what is actually driving the assets, the access to basic services index? My second question also has to do with using the highest, or I think the maximum years of education as a proxy for access. Can you please explain how the number of years of schooling is a measure of access to education, for instance? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Monica. I don't see any more hands up. So I'm going to have Mona, would you like to respond to this question? And if we see any more hands up, and then we'll take additional questions that may come up. So Mona, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Monica. So regarding the first question,
hello, Mona. Can
yes,
you hear
can
me?
you hear me? Yes, yes. Thank you, Monica. Okay, regarding the first question, yes, I tried to look at it. Among the four indicators to access to basic services, obviously the one which have shown significant improvement is access to telephone. So across countries, there is significant improvement in access to telephone, and that contributes to the reduction, largely contributes to the reduction in access to basic services. And also there is significant improvement in terms of access to education. So both factors play significantly to the reduction in access to inequality to access to basic services. But largely it's access to telephone among the four indicators. But we can see that across all countries, all the indicators have improved significantly. Regarding the second question, using the maximum years of education in the household to measure access to education. Obviously, we are not measuring properly access to education, but use of or education attainment by households. So it's not necessarily, even if all of the indicators don't necessarily measure access to education or other services as a proper definition of access, but it allows us to measure access to these services when we use the use of these services as a proxy measure of access to education or other indicators. So it's not necessarily we are measuring it as a proper measure of access, but the use of these services can be used as a proxy measure of access, because we don't really have data to measure accesses. The reason we have chosen maximum years of education in the household, usually one approach is obviously to use enrollment, child enrollment, or other approaches to use years of education for adults. But we assume that maximum years of education can allow us to capture changes over time. So, for example, if you use adult education, this might not be changed over time, because once adults have completed certain years of education, they might not pursue education, so it might be eliminated. But if we use maximum years of education in the household, we expect it to change over time, maybe because of the change in education to children. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much for your responses, Mona. There is another question in the Q&A chat. So this is from Justin Visagie, and he's asking, spatial inequality seemed to be measured by comparing averages between regions. However, these averages themselves might mask considerable variation or inequality within each of these regions. He wonders if it wouldn't be worth looking at the percentage of those who fall below a threshold.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting comment. Yes, obviously, the use of averages to compare inequalities across regions masks the level of inequality within regions. So our objective here is to compare inequalities across regions. So for that purpose, we have to have a representative household, which is assigned the average figure for the region. But obviously, we can look at whether the approach suggested the use of the proportion of people below the certain threshold obviously might improve the comparison. And thank you for the comment.
Okay, thank you for the response, Mona. Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, I was curious about a couple of things. I thought it was a really interesting presentation. And while we wait for a few more people to put their hands up if they have questions, I wanted to ask, so in deciding which variables to include in the indicator list for measuring, the non-consumption inequality, I just wondered how you arrived at that decision, what to include, what not to include. Well, because you included something like education, right? But then something like working status or employment didn't make its way into, as one of the variables to use to construct the indicator. So I wondered about that. And then I cannot help but to comment on the fact that, when you showed us those graphs of Africa, and you showed that using your construction of inequality, it looked as if South Africa had one of the lowest levels of inequality. Now, I wanted to wonder about, well, then the robustness of the indicator you measure, because when we compare it to, standard measures of inequality, South Africa usually has, if not the highest, one of the highest levels of inequality. Now, you did show another graph where when you compare your construct with what is typically used when we use the consumption data, it looked as if there's a very good relationship between your construction and then inequality constructions using consumption. But I wanted to get your take on it. Then what would explain this sort of complete reversal of the inequality picture when you look at the distribution across Africa, particularly with respect to South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So regarding the number of indicators we included, obviously the first thing which determines what kind of indicators you're going to use is data availability and also data comparability. So if you want to talk about comparison across time and across countries, the data availability determines what kind of indicators you can include. So even if some of the indicators might be important in terms of measuring well-being, you are not able to include them. We are not able to include them because they are not available in many of the countries we consider. So that's the key limitation that we have to understand when we measure inequalities in access to basic services or access to assets. Even measuring access to basic services, those 5 indicators is not easy in terms of comparability across time and across the countries, because the way they label them and code them varies across time in this case. So that's the limitation that we face when we decide what kind of indicators we should include in a given analysis. Regarding the relationship between measures of assets inequality and income inequality, when you include more indicators, asset indicators, you will find some correlation, better correlation with income inequalities. But when we limit our indicators to access to basic services, education, electricity, water, and sanitation, clearly there is no relationship in the analysis that we have seen. And the South African case stands out, obviously, because we know South Africa is one of the highest income inequality country. But when it comes to access to basic services, South Africa performs much better than other countries. So the level of inequality in access to basic services in South Africa is much, much lower than compared to other African countries, which is not necessarily reflected when you use income or consumption data. Because in consumption data, you are not able to calculate, for example, access to basic services such as education, access to basic services, which are highly subsidized by the state. And that's the limitation of also using expenditure data to measure inequality.
Thank you so much.
So
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So that's the key issue, that we have these different pictures of inequality. So Southern African countries perform much better than other African countries when it comes to access to basic services.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, we have 3 additional questions. So we have another question from Justin. So he says, a rise in spatial inequality appears to be negatively related to GDP growth. He is asking if this is correct, It's surprising because it suggests that growth is trickling down, which is not a common finding in the literature. So that's the first question from Justin. There's another question from David Gordon, which says, do the relationships you found change if you look at people living in rural and urban areas separately? And then the final question from Justin, spatial inequality in sub-Saharan Africa seems to be increasing in all countries except Rwanda. Is this plausible? And so we'd appreciate any responses you have to any of these.
Okay, regarding Justine's question, let me open the graph. So this is a graph, and let me also open the change in equality, spatial inequality. Here. Most questions refer to spatial inequality because spatial inequality seems to be increasing. So what we have here is, in fact, the opposite. Spatial inequality increased only in Rwanda. So if you see this x-axis, the x-axis is changing spatial inequality, the y-axis is changing national equality. And the negative figure indicates increase in spatial inequality, while the positive figures indicate progress. So we have multiplied the change in the calculation in change inequality by -1 to make it a bit less messy. So the positive, when we go to the positive side, the x-axis indicates improvement, which is a reduction in spatial inequality. While if you go to the negative side, it shows decline, increase in inequality. So it's the opposite. What we have is not actually spatial inequality decreased in many African countries. It's or in Rwanda case, for example, it's actually increased, not decreased. So I hope I answered Justine's question.
Yes, thank
you. Regarding David's question, does the relationship you found change if you look at people living in rural areas? We haven't done the analysis separately. Maybe it was well to look at it. But when it comes to measuring regional inequalities, I'm not sure whether we need to do separate analysis for rural and urban areas to measure spatial inequality across in a given country. So we haven't done that.
You need to ask that you keep your responses as brief as possible, just so we don't run out of time. So thank you. Please continue.
Hello.
Yes, Muna, I was asking that just so we don't run out of time, if you could please keep your responses, you know, as brief as you can, just so we don't.
Okay. So we haven't looked at whether the changes vary by rural urban areas.
All right, Muna, okay, then thank you very much for these responses. And there was a question earlier on as to whether you would have access to the presentation slides and then to the material that the actual paper. And Hajira responded that yes, it will be made available on the ACEIR website. So you will be able to have access to what Muna has presented and then the paper underlying the presentation. So at this point, I would like to thank Dr. Shifa for her presentation. We are very grateful, and I'm sure we have learned a lot from this session. I would also like to thank our audience members for their very valuable contribution. Your participation was very much appreciated. So at this point, I'd like to wish everybody a happy Africa Day, and I would now like to bring the webinar to a close. Thank you again for your participation.
Thanks all.